ELCA Ecumenical Affairs Committee. Carol has taught and lived in Damascus, Syria, and in Sana'a, Yemen. She continued biblical research in Luke and Acts, and also did research on the role of women in Islam. Today, referring to the Bible and the Quran, she will consider the position of women in Islam and Christianity in such Muslim countries as Syria, Egypt, and Yemen. We're also proud to say that both Carol and Ryan are active supporters of our Augsburg Associates program, and we thank them for being here today. Dr. LaHurd.
Thank you very much for inviting both of us. I think I should start this morning by giving credit to my human sources in the study of women in Islam. I had the privilege of teaching English in 1981-82 in Damascus, Syria, and had many Muslim students and friends. And then most recently, from September to January, as you know, we lived in Sana'a, the capital of North Yemen. Ryan, do you want to put the map back on so they can see where that is? And in Sana'a, my English class, which was at the Yemen American Language Institute, consisted of 15 young adults from about the ages of 18 to 30. I had 7 men who wore usually Western-style clothes and sat on one side of the room, and 8 women who sat on the other side of the room, and generally wore long coats and scarves, and 2 wore black face veils so that only their eyes were visible. Believe it or not, I got to know who they were just by seeing their eyes, even before I heard their voices. People like that have been very instrumental in my interest in Islam and have added greatly to my knowledge of Islam. But I also must give credit to my friends of the Muslim-Christian Dialogue, which has been going now in the Twin Cities for 3 years. I think I've learned as much from them in 3 years as in 10 years of academic study of Islam. This morning my talk will have 2 parts. The first, the treatment of women in the scriptures of Islam and Christianity, the Quran and the Bible, and second, something about the reality of women's lives in Islam. I hope most of you, if not all of you, have the yellow handout that has some of the passages that I'll be referring to. Before we start, though, I want to share a caveat and an assumption. There's a Roman Catholic scholar, Leonard Swidler, at Temple University, who's a great leader in interfaith dialogue. And in 1983, he published something called the Dialogue Decalogue, 10 guidelines for authentic interfaith discussion. And I would add, they also are good guidelines for comparative study of religion. Guideline number 4 is especially pertinent for today's topic. It goes like this. In interreligious dialogue, we must not compare our ideals with our dialogue partner's practice, but rather our ideals with our partner's ideals and our practice with our partner's practice. Too often, popular Western depictions compare the best in Christianity's theoretical perspective on women. For instance, the Apostle Paul's assertion in Galatians 3 that, quote, in Christ there is no longer slave nor free, male nor female, etc., with some of the worst practices in a particular Islamic culture, such as the Saudi legislation prohibiting women from driving cars. Second, I want to share an assumption. Underlying my remarks today is the belief that there are historical and scriptural reasons to group together Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as the Abrahamic faiths. And that despite important conceptual differences, it is to this same God of Abraham that all 3 of these faith groups strive to obey. Today we'll look at the Bible and the Quran for the themes of first, women's place in creation, second, spiritual equality, and third, male and female roles and relationships. There's time for only a sampling of texts on these topics, and most of them are in order on the handout. As far as the creation picture is concerned, when we turn to Genesis 1 and 2, we have the immediate problem of a mixed picture in the Bible. Genesis 1:27 declares, so God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. This account of the creation of the human seems to have the two genders be created in an equal and simultaneous event. Then we move to the Genesis 2 creation account. This probably originated from a different and much older group of writers. It has the female created from the rib of the male, and the man saying, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of the man this one was taken." Now it seems to me you could use this either as an affirmation of equality or of male superiority and domination. Genesis 3:16, which is not on your sheet, further complicates the picture with God's punishment to the female, including pain in childbirth, and the decree that the husband shall rule over her. There are many comparable passages in the Quran, and the ones on your sheet are taken from A. Yusuf Ali's translation, the 1988 edition. This is a useful edition of the Quran because it has extensive footnotes and it has the Arabic text on one side of the page and the English text on the other. The Quran, the scripture of Islam, is divided into 114 chapters called surahs in Arabic, so that's why this period is typed in front of each quotation. The creation of the human, the generic human in the Quran, is described as being from dust in Surah 22:5 and from a sperm drop in Surah 23:13. When a distinction of gender arises, the emphasis seems to be on equality and mutuality. In Surah 7, verse 189, which you have, "It is he who created you from a single person and made his mate of like nature in order that he might dwell with her in love." A quick aside, the Quranic account of the first human sin has both the male and the female succumbing to Satan's temptation to eat of the forbidden tree. They both repent, and God is recorded as forgiving their weakness and promising to provide guidance for them in the future, in contrast to the individualized punishments of Genesis 3. It's only later in the Hadith, the post-Quranic traditions in Islam, about the life and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, that we encounter the story of the creation of the female via Adam's rib, or the male's rib. Now I'd like to say just a bit about spiritual equality in the two traditions. In the Bible, we have such passages as Genesis 1:27 and Galatians 3:28 that emphasize gender equality. Those passages also appear in the Quran. Surah 33:35 is a description of the ideal Muslim, one who submits to the will of God. That's what the term Muslim means. And it refers in every verse to both male and female. For Muslim men and women, for devout men and women, for men and women who are patient and constant, for men and women who humble themselves, for men and women who give in charity, for men and women who fast and deny themselves, for men and women who guard their chastity, and for men and women who engage much in God's praise, for them has God prepared forgiveness and a great reward. When we turn to the third topic, male and female roles and relationships, again the Bible, I believe, presents a mixed picture. On the one hand, there is the ritual uncleanness of women in Leviticus that carries over into New Testament times, and the apparent view of women as property in the Mosaic commandment about coveting what belongs to one's neighbor. On the other hand, there are the stories glorifying such Israelite women as Moses' sister Miriam and the prophet Huldah, who interpreted the book of the law and helped initiate King Josiah's reform in the 7th century BCE. My own scholarly work is primarily with that part of the Christian Bible called the New Testament. Here again, the portrait is ambiguous. First, two negative passages. I think they're on your sheet. 1 Corinthians 14. This is an authentic letter of Paul to an actual community of Christians in Corinth in southern Greece. As in all the churches of the saints, women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. If there is anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Now, there's several ways modern scholars have to deal with problematic passages like this. I'd say the two major theories about this one are, first, that this is a later insertion, something added probably by a critic of Paul, as Paul was really an advocate often for women's role of leadership in the church, and this passage seems to clearly contradict a number of statements of authentic Pauline letters elsewhere. The second theory, which is rather ingenious, but I think certainly worth considering, is that this is in fact an authentic statement of Paul, but Paul is being intentionally ironic. He's following verse 35 with verse 36, which can be translated, but usually isn't translated this way. What? Exclamation point. Did the word of God originate with you? Are you, meaning males, the only ones it has reached? Ironically suggesting that this kind of assertion that has proceeded in verse 35 doesn't hold any water. Another negative example comes from 1 Timothy 2. This is a much later letter. This letter is often attributed to Paul in older editions of the Bible, but it's clearly much later than the time of Paul and is considered by scholars a pseudonymous pastoral epistle, probably written during a time of reassertion of household codes and patriarchal control. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. Both, by the way, both the translation from Greek and the interpretation of this passage is much debated. And I'm happy to say that modern critical methods give scholars some help with dealing with passages like this. In contrast to these restrictions on women is the assumption that women will be praying and prophesying in public. In direct contrast to these first two is 1 Corinthians 11. It's not on your sheet, but in 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16, Paul counsels Christian women to cover their heads when they pray or prophesy in public, clearly indicating that such activity is proper, in contradiction to 1 Corinthians 14. In Acts 2:17, which I believe you do have, we have Peter's Pentecost sermon, what was preached shortly after the gift of the Holy Spirit came to the disciples in Jerusalem after Jesus' ascension. Peter quotes the Hebrew prophet Joel. In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my spirit, and they shall prophesy. Also relevant is the record of female religious leaders in Acts and in the letters of Paul. In fact, in talking about these female religious leaders, the Greek text uses grammatically male terms, such as apostle, prophet, and deacon, even when naming people who are clearly women, such as Phoebe or Junia. Seems to me, and to most or many biblical scholars, that suggests that these women functioned in these roles as did male Christian leaders, and no distinction was made, at least not grammatically and in terms of the titles. Especially significant, of course, is Jesus' public affirmation of women in such narratives as the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4 and Mary and Martha, the sisters in Luke 10. Time really prevents us from making a systematic analysis of all the passages about legislation regarding women in the Bible and the Quran. But if we move to that area of study, we see that the importance of family is certainly central in both scriptural traditions. Just as a minor or small example from the Christian tradition is printed on your sheet from Matthew 19. Jesus in the Gospels repudiated divorce and affirmed mutuality in marriage. Matthew is often thought to be the most Jewish of the Gospels, and Jesus in Matthew 19 is reported to have said that it was because you were hard-hearted that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity and marries another commits adultery. I think, by the way, that we can see the lasting influence of this passage and others like it in U.S. divorce laws, which until very recently required adultery as the cause to be cited. What about the Muslim tradition? The Quran and the later development of Sharia or Islamic law assume, one, that marriage is the norm, and two, that the family is the basic unit of society. key features of the Muslim concept of family. With regard to husband and wife mutuality, we have Surah 30, verse 21. And among his signs, in other words, indications that we have of God's greatness and God's providence for humankind, is this, that he created for you mates from among yourselves, that ye may dwell in tranquility with them, and he has put love and mercy between your hearts. Verily, in that are signs for those who reflect. But in the Islamic tradition, this mutuality is with differing abilities and roles. The male is thought to support and protect the family. Surah 4:34 reads, "Men are the protectors and maintainers of women, because God has given the one more strength and the other because they support, more strength than the other, because they support them from their means. Therefore, the righteous women are devoutly obedient and guard in the husband's absence what God would have them guard, whether that includes offspring, land, money, etc., traditions, values. The woman is considered the manager of the home and the children. In fact, there's an Arab Muslim proverb that is translated, the mother is a school. The second feature of this emphasis on the family is a very definite emphasis on chastity and modesty for both males and females. I think often it's a Western misperception that these are emphasized for females only. That's not to say that in practice the double standard doesn't exist in Arab Muslim countries as much as it does in their own. It certainly does. But at the level of the scriptural witness, we see an equal emphasis. Surah 24:30. Say to the believing men that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty. That will make for greater purity for them, and God is well acquainted with all they do. And say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty. In Surah 24:32, sexual intercourse is for both sexes is to be delayed until one has the economic means for marriage. On the issue of women's dress, what actually appears in the Quran is often far different from Western stereotypes and from the cultural practices in some Muslim countries. 24:31 says, "And say to the believing women that they should not display their beauty and ornaments except what must ordinarily appear thereof, that they should draw their veils over their bosoms and not display their beauty except to their husbands, their father, their husbands' fathers, their sons, etc." There's a special injunction for the wives and daughters of the prophet. By the way, the Quran, I should explain for those of you who aren't familiar with it, contains many of the same narratives that are in the Old Testament, the patriarchal stories, for example, from Genesis, the story of the Exodus. There's an entire chapter called Mariam or Mary on the birth of Jesus. But there are also in the Quran a number of specific prescriptions for Muhammad and his followers in Mecca and Medina. This is an example of one of those. An injunction particularly addressed to Muhammad's wives and daughters. Prophet, tell thy wives and daughters and the believing women that they should cast their outer garments over their persons when abroad. That is most convenient, that they should be known as such and not molested. Excuse me, I think this passage accounts for the requirement that women wear flowing cloaks in many Muslim countries, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen would be examples. And there's a tremendous amount of disagreement in the Islamic world about whether this injunction applies to all women in all historical periods or whether it was a particular piece of advice for one historical period. There are many Muslim countries where women do not cover any more than women do in this country. So obviously they interpret it differently. All of these injunctions about dress and modesty are open to extreme variations in interpretation. And a good example of a very conservative one comes from the 13th century, from a Persian Quranic scholar whose words I fear, I guess, betraying my point of view, are still very operative in parts of the Islamic world. He wrote of passage 24:31, which you have on the sheet, "Indeed, the whole of the woman's body is to be regarded as pudental, that is, as private parts, and no part of her may lawfully be seen by anyone but her husband or close kin, except in case of need, as when she is undergoing medical treatment or giving evidence. On this issue of modest dress, we also have a relevant passage in Christianity. In that same earlier 1 Timothy passage in chapter 2, the following verse, 2:9, which I don't think I have on your sheet, reads, the women should dress themselves modestly and decently in suitable clothing, not with their hair braided or with gold, pearls, or expensive clothes, but with good works. So extremely parallel passage from 1 Timothy. A third feature of the Muslim family is that in the Quran, men are still favored in divorce and inheritance laws, as outlined in Surah 65, 1-6. But the legislation on divorce and inheritance in the Quran was a revolutionary improvement over the situation in pre-Islamic Arabia. I think we have to have a little further elaboration on this point. In Arabia, prior to Islam, by the way, as a formal religion began in the 7th century in Mecca, women had little or no control over marriage and divorce, and they had virtually no inheritance rights. They had no property rights, I guess you could say, and they could be divorced quite easily with absolutely no provision made for their care or the care of their children. The Quran in Surah 4:4 gives women the right to contract their own marriage agreement, and by the way, also the right of refusal. This unfortunately is not observed in some Muslim countries today. Secondly, the Quran also gives women the right to own property, although generally at a rate of half that for men, for example, in an inheritance situation. And the justification for that discrepancy is that in the Arab family system, or the Muslim family system, men are considered the primary supporters of the family, and so it's considered legitimate to give male sons double the inheritance in terms of land or money or whatever as the daughters receive. Also, excuse me, it needs to be pointed out that in most of the Western industrialized countries, women did not receive the right to inherit or own property until the 19th century. So this is an area in which Islam was ahead of the West by, what is that, about 1,200 years at least. Also, the Quran put limits on polygamy. It really should be called polygamy. Marriage of multiple wives, marriage of multiple husbands is not permitted in Islam. In polygamy or polygamy before the time of the Prophet Muhammad, Arab Muslim or Arab polytheist men, I guess you could say, had numerous wives. The Quran limited it to 4 wives and said that all must be treated equally, meaning both emotionally and economically. That's Surah 4:3. But if ye fear that ye shall not be able to deal justly with them, then only one wife. That will be more suitable to prevent you from doing injustice. In the historical beginning period of Islam, this practice of polygamy was considered to have positive social aims. There were a number of widows and orphans created by the early Islamic wars, and this was one way to take care of those widows and orphans. And by the way, as I was told by many of my women friends in Yemen, it was also a way to control the male tendency toward infidelity. Lastly, women in the Quran were guaranteed some divorce rights, 2:28, and women shall have rights similar to the rights against them according to what is equitable, but men have a degree of advantage over them, and this has persisted to the present day. In most countries that have Islamic family law codes, which is the majority, by the way, even the secularized countries like Syria have a certain degree to which laws about marriage, divorce, and inheritance are governed by Islamic law, not civil, secular law, that men still do have a considerable degree of advantage. In the original founding days of Islam, again, justification was because of men's greater economic status and responsibility. I'd like to make a few concluding observations about the scriptural records of these two traditions before turning to the present-day reality. Although on the level of the theoretical ideal, both the Bible and the Quran present a mixed picture, I think one can certainly make a case for gender equality through a careful and informed reading of both scriptures. As noted at the outset, the status of women in both Islam and Christianity depends very much on the interpretation and use of these texts, in particular cultures and historical periods. Here, I think Christians have considerably more latitude than do Muslims. If they accept the position that the Old Testament and the New Testament evolved gradually with a combination of divine inspiration and human effort. For all but the biblical literalists, such disciplines as historical and redaction criticism can, as Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, a feminist New Testament scholar, says, these critical tools can help us work with the text to separate, quote, the word of God from the words of men. For observant Muslims, most of whom believe that the Arabic text of the Quran is the actual words of God, the task becomes one of reinterpreting those exact words for the present circumstances. As in Christianity, there is a wide range of attitudes, from complete repudiation of compromise with non-Islamic ideas and practices to the use of the Quran for religious guidance, but not for absolute legislation. Now I'd like to turn to the reality of life for women in Islam. There's time, unfortunately, only to talk about the reality of life for women in Islam. I'm assuming that most of you have a diversity of impressions about life for women in organized Christianity. Just to point out, however, that if Christian Americans want to get too smug about the superior rights of women in this part of the world compared to the Arab Muslim world, for example, you should check out the recent Amnesty International reports about the torture of women political prisoners in Central and South America. Those are countries, all countries that have historically considered themselves Christian countries, and it's really unbelievable the level of brutality that is inflicted on women, female prisoners. This morning, however, we'll talk about women in Islam. First, I'll give you some concrete examples from the diversity of Islamic cultures that I've observed. Second, I'll show you a few slides of women and their lives in Syria and Yemen, the two Arab countries we've lived in. And third, I'll share some more specific reflections about women and Islam in Yemen, where we just returned. You should know that over 50 countries have Muslim majorities. Only 1/6 of the world's Muslims are in the Arab Middle East, or are Arabs. Most of the world's Muslims live in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and Indonesia has the single largest Muslim population with about 150 million Muslims. My familiarity, however, is with mainly the Middle Eastern Muslim world. Here's a few concrete examples. Saudi Arabia, for example, a largely Sunni Muslim Arab country, has separate educational institutions and separate workplaces to allow women to have education and careers. So that means there are, in fact, women's hospitals, women's banks, women's universities, etc. So there are indeed career opportunities for women in Saudi Arabia. There are also very strict rules about dress and behavior, rules that are enforced by religious police who can detain you, beat you, fine you, etc. for not wearing full Islamic dress, which includes a coat and a scarf and a veil, and also for such infractions as talking to a male to whom you're not related in public. There is certainly agitation for change in Saudi Arabia. My husband talked a little bit about the political agitation. There's certainly agitation for cultural change with regard to women's rights. You probably remember reading in November 1990 about a women's demonstration about the rule about not driving cars. About 50 women participated in a convoy of 15 cars. They were, of course, arrested. The government reaffirmed the prohibition on women not driving cars, and that was viewed as a concession to the conservative Muslims with whom they have, the Saud family has been in league almost this entire century as part of a way to keep their power over the country. And many of my Arab male friends here in the Twin Cities speculated when they read about this convoy demonstration that the women probably had their husband's support, and they took that as a very significant sign that not only women, but men in Saudi Arabia were fed up with government controls on such things. And they speculated that the women probably were the ones to do it because the families knew that the women would be punished, but certainly not as severely as if their husbands had participated initiated it. And so I thought that was an interesting analysis. Iran is another example. A very mixed picture from what I've been able to gather about what's happening with women's rights in Iran. But I'll just share kind of an interesting example. The revolutionary regime that replaced the Shah in Iran is, I think, very sensitive to women's issues on a lot of levels, but also very clear about wanting to maintain strict gender segregation. That is one way to interpret Islam, is to insist on gender segregation outside of the nuclear or extended family. Well, in February of this year, the Wall Street Journal reported it, I don't know how many other places it was reported that the first Islamic women's athletic games were held in Iran. And women came from all over the Muslim world, not just the Arab Muslim world, from places like Malaysia, for example. Women athletes came to compete, partly because it's so difficult for women from strict Islamic countries to compete in the Olympics. No male spectators were allowed anywhere near the events requiring scanty clothing, running, swimming, high jumping, etc. But those were held, and the women were allowed to wear bathing suits and shorts. But even their own fathers and brothers and husbands were not allowed to watch them compete, because of course then those men would be watching women to whom they are not related. Other events in which women could wear the full hijab, that means the full Islamic dress with a scarf, a face veil, and a coat with only maybe the hands and eyes showing. Other events were held, such as target shooting, which is very popular in a lot of Muslim countries, and men were allowed to come and watch those events. On an ongoing basis, Iran is making it more possible for female athletes to train. There's a runner's park in Tehran that now has extensive hours for women's only running 3 days a week to permit women to train wearing shorts and not having to wear a long coat that comes down to their ankles and a scarf and a veil. Iran and Saudi Arabia are two countries that apply Islamic law extensively in the daily lives of women. Iraq and Syria are more secularized examples of Arab Muslim countries. In Iraq, even after his costly invasion of Kuwait, Saddam Hussein is credited by women as being very instrumental in progress for women's rights and women's lives in Iraq. Women comprise 1/3 of the urban workforce in Iraq and 1/2 of the rural workforce. And 2/3 of working professionals with advanced degrees in Iraq are women. In Syria also, women have much greater freedom of dress and association than they do in Iran and Saudi Arabia. According to a woman professor in the University of Damascus English Department, which, by the way, is where my husband taught in 81-82 when we lived there, she asserts that women now pretty much receive equal pay, equal opportunity, and equal education in Syria. 1/2 of the university English students and 40% of the professors are women. Women are in many positions in the government. They are ambassadors, engineers, and doctors. And this one really surprised me. 25% of the Syrian parliament has women representatives. Do you know what the percentage is of the U.S. Congress? We just got to 10% this year with the November election. So I think that's a very helpful comparison. On the other hand, in Syria, there are still difficulties, definitely, for women with marriage and divorce laws, and a great degree of inequity that's still built into the family law codes in Syria. I think these are just a few examples to show you the tremendous diversity in conditions for Muslim women. Often there are varied and complex causes for these conditions, and oppression of women in Muslim countries often occurs in spite of Islam, not because of Islam. Many of the practices that the Western mind associates with Islam are actually cultural and even pre-Islamic in origin. I'll give you one good example. Female circumcision is still practiced in both Egypt and the Sudan. Even, by the way, among rural Christians. Both Egypt and Sudan have significant Christian populations. Female circumcision is a millennia-old practice involving varying degrees of mutilation. But at the level of folk religion, female circumcision has been revalidated under Islam because of the extreme concern about sexual temptation and guarding virginity. and the thought that any surgery, it's really more mutilation than surgery in most cases, will lessen a woman's sexual desire and increase the chances that the family honor will be guarded and that her virginity will be guarded. Despite opposition and educational efforts by the Sudanese government, it's estimated that still 3/4 of Sudanese girls are circumcised. So that's an example of a practice that in the Western mind is associated with Islam, whereas in fact, in many cases, Islamic leaders are arguing against the practice, and it goes back way before Islamic times. Now I'd like to show you a few of our slides. What you're going to see are a few pictures of women in Syria and Yemen. And these are Arab Muslim women only. Veiling of women that you'll see in these slides is much less common in other Islamic areas such as Southeast Asia. We lived in Syria in 81-82 and observed that it was a much more westernized and secularized country than a lot of what we hear about in the media. It's over 90% Muslim, and there's an active Christian minority. Yemen, of course, we lived in last fall, and North Yemen especially is 100% Muslim, and was, as Ryan pointed out, very cut off from the outside world until the overthrow of the last imam, or political religious leader in the early 60s. In both Syria and Yemen, you'll also note differences between the urban women and the rural and village women. So I think we can start the slides now, and I don't know if there's any point in turning the lights down. If you can see okay, then we'll just leave it the way it is. Picture should come on in a second here. This is the modern city of Damascus, where we lived 10 years ago, a city of about 2 million people. Most people live in concrete high-rise apartment buildings, so this you're seeing is the modern side of the city. An old part of the city is the bazaar or souk. Southdale thinks it's the oldest shopping mall in the world. It certainly isn't. The Souk al-Hamadiyya in Damascus is hundreds of years older than Southdale. Here you can see the diversity of dress of people in the souk or the bazaar, men and women in both Western style and Arab style clothes. A village woman here with a couple of chickens that have been brought into the butcher area. Generally, rural women dress much more colorfully. This is a village near Damascus where we spent a day visiting some Roman ruins. Here you can see some school children in typical government uniforms in Syria in front of probably 2nd century Greco-Roman style temple. Here's a young sister and brother who had never met us before and entertained us for lunch. In fact, the villagers fought over who could invite us to lunch that day, even though we arrived unexpected. Here's their older sister, who we can see dresses slightly more modestly than the younger sister. A different village, I think we took this picture from a bus window. Again, you can see the variety of dress. Dress is often a clue to the male-female segregation issue. Women, rural women, again in a southern village on the northern border of Jordan. And here is a picture of my English class in Damascus. You can see that, again, most of the men and women wear Western-style dress, only 2 women with scarves. The same class took a picnic in the countryside. They brought their families. There was complete mixing of men and women. Here now is the city of Sana'a, where we just returned from. Very old, beautiful old architecture, mud brick and stone buildings. This is a dry wadi on the edge of the old city of Sana'a. Again, the souk or bazaar area of the old city. You can see how the houses are decorated. Very elaborate windows and stonework. In this one, there's a window on the upper right of the slide that was probably designed as a place for women to stand so they could look out and see what was happening in the street and not be seen. This is at the university, where the situation is quite different. You can see veiled women on the right and unveiled women. People in the English department, again, all the women wear scarves and coats, but almost none of them wear face veils at the university. My male students that I referred to at the Yemen American Language Institute, some of the male ones. There's fewer female students because some didn't want to be in the picture. So there I am with the 3 brave ones who were willing to be in the picture that I would bring back to America. From our our bedroom window, we took these pictures of rural people coming in to gather grass and brush for their livestock. Yemen is an extremely mountainous country, and now I'm taking you out to a village in the far north of Yemen. And this village has a very modern city center, but again, you can see that the women cover completely, very much. We saw virtually no unveiled women. This is the souk or bazaar area. Again, almost no women are even there. The ones who are completely covered, but it's largely a male world. In another rural area of Yemen, you can see that women are certainly out and about, often not veiled, but always covered up. We call these women the bedspread ladies because they literally wore Indian-made bedspreads as their main cover. In the countryside, they were much more colorful than in the city. These women are shaking rugs, and they completely covered, including their face, to go out on their own roof and shake rugs, even though there's hardly ever any tourists that come to their village. I mean, it wasn't only for tourists, it was for everyone else that they were covering. It's typical village scenes. Young girls are covered almost as much as women past puberty. The girl on the left, I put this slide in, is very rare to see someone dressed like a young American girl with jeans and a blouse. That was very unusual. This is much more common for the dress of small girls in rural and villages. Finally, I think we're now on the road to Aden. South Yemen is quite different from North Yemen because of the British presence and then the Soviet presence. You can see that even though it's mountainous, much of it is quite arable. There are terraces growing everything from coffee to sorghum. This woman has probably spent the entire day gathering food and bedding for the family animals. That's now Aden, a volcanic region right on the Indian Ocean. And one of the last pictures is the 3 MA students that Ryan gave lectures to on 3 different occasions. We went down to Aden. You can see the woman is dressed, one woman is dressed completely like a Westerner. Here, what you can barely see in this picture, I don't know if there's a pause that I can push. Yeah, here's a pause. In the right near the coastline, you can't really see it, unfortunately, in the video of this. That little black blob near the water is 2 women sunbathing in completely covered, everything but their hands and eyes covered in black. And unfortunately, it doesn't show very well when it's on the TV monitor. Down the beach to the right were about 4 different soccer games in which men and boys were wearing usually long pants and t-shirts, but even some wearing shorts and t-shirts. And the only 2 women anywhere in sight. I think this was on a Friday afternoon, so it was like a day off from work for them, and that was really all there were the way of women at the beach. They're beautiful beaches in Aden, but they're not used in the way that they're used in here in the West. Well, those, as I said, are a few examples of some of the images that you see when you go to this part of the world. I'll just spend a few more minutes telling you about conditions for women in Yemen, and then we can have some more questions for both of us if you want. My research in Yemen, on women in Yemen, consisted of really taking a look at particularly 3 areas: gender segregation, marriage and the family, and education and work outside the home. And in order to study these things, I first went, or among the things I did was went to a lot of print reports on women in the Arab Muslim world. But then I also had many chances to observe women in social situations informally. I conducted some structured interviews with both women and with male religious scholars, and in that, our women friends, the instructors in the English department at the university, were extremely helpful because my Arabic is so rudimentary I never could have conducted extensive interviews with male religious scholars, so one of the English department professors usually accompanied me and served as a translator. So that was extremely helpful. And I also read, both of us in fact, read a lot of Arab fiction in translation, and that's also a very good source of information about women and family in the Arab Muslim world. Well, I'd say the key word, which Ryan has already referred to with regard to women's lives in Yemen, is also change. First, I'll say a little bit about gender say this is probably the most shocking part of living there for us. I mean, it was exhausting not having safe drinking water, having to do all the family laundry in the kitchen sink, having to learn how to use Arabic to take taxis or buy vegetables. You know, that was a certain amount of cultural stress, but nothing compared with the gender role differences or the way gender is treated in Yemen compared to the U.S. A 1979 study reported that all Yemeni female students at the University of Sana'a were veiled. That was 13 years before we arrived. When we arrived in 1992, 95% of the Yemeni students, at least, still covered their hair, but less than 20%, I would say, had face veils. So that was a huge reduction in the number wearing face veils in 13 years. Yemen is really divided into two realms, and here I'm talking mostly about North Yemen, which has, as we've said, been cut off from the west much longer than the southern part of Yemen has. There are two realms, the public male realm and the private realm for females and families. In the public realm, men outnumber women 100 to 1. No question about it. That was the first shock. Being one of the few women, period, on the city streets, and the only Westerner woman in many cases. The exception may be at night in the souk, in the old shopping area, the old bazaar area. You see slightly more women, maybe up to 10% or so of the total number, and they're usually out with their husbands and fully covered and veiled. Women receive some harassment when they go out in public. Of course, women receive some harassment here when they're out in public too. For instance, my daughter and I were stared at constantly, and staring is not considered impolite in that culture. And I think it was that they just have seen so few Western females that probably accounted for the staring. There are even Yemeni women who venture out and don't dress totally covered, might receive some verbal harassment, and there is a small amount of harassment, I think, against Yemeni women who drive. Many Yemeni women do drive. There is no legislation preventing them, but my friends told me that they felt that some men really resented the fact that they drove, and you have to understand driving patterns in Yemen. There are almost no stop signs or stoplights, so every intersection is a game of chicken. There's cars coming from 4 or 5 directions, and who's going to go through the intersection first? And some women felt that men used that opportunity to kind of harass them for having the gall to be out driving by, cutting them off impolitely. But they cut each other, men off too, when they were driving. Most restaurants in Sana'a, the capital, are considered for men only. That doesn't mean there's a sign that prevents you from coming in. It's just that you will be stared at, and you will be really breaking with tradition if you go in all but a few restaurants that had separate areas, often with partitions for women and family. And that was a very tiny percentage of the total number of restaurants in Yemen. Luckily for us, there was much less constraints or constraint on me as a Western woman, and so I often ate in so-called men's restaurants, and people were quite polite. They stared, but they were also polite. The women who do venture out wear long coats and scarves, and I'd say on the city streets, probably 50 to 70% wear also face veils. In the private realm, there are, of course, numerous women's gatherings, from everything from mothers and sisters and daughters getting together to huge women's parties with very elaborate entertainment, live entertainment, fancy dresses, and you wouldn't believe the number of imported fabric shops in Yemen. And these women are not wearing these things in public or to their jobs. They're mostly wearing them to women's only functions, where they will dress very much the way American women might dress going to a charity ball or something like that. Another clue to the existence of the public realm and the private realm is the layout of family houses. Now you understand most of the houses are parts of larger buildings, like those tower houses you saw on the slides, or apartment buildings. But even within a family apartment, a Yemeni apartment, there's often a big foyer or entryway, and then the house or the flat kind of splits off into 2 areas. A big public sitting room where male visitors can be entertained, and then there's an inner foyer and that connects to the kitchen and the bedrooms and the family sitting room so that the women can go about their lives and the man of the family can entertain men, unrelated men, and they'll never have to come into contact with the women and the children of the family. And in fact, we observe that quite often when Ryan would be invited to a male-only professor's cock shoe. I sometimes was invited to go keep company with the wife of the hostess and maybe some of her female relatives and neighbors. And that was extremely interesting for me. And of course, being a Western woman, I was welcome at either half of the house. And so sometimes went back and forth between the male-only party and then the female social time, which was also very rich, but separate from the male social time. There are exceptions to this strict segregation. For example, in the rural areas and in the south of Yemen, there is considerably more gender mixing outside of families. In the rural areas, simply because it was a necessity. The work with animals and planting required that everybody work together, and women usually wear dresses and leggings and scarves, but they don't cover their faces, and they wear much more serviceable clothing often than women in the cities do. There are also now increasing numbers of women working in government offices and banks, but they're usually working at a desk where they can be apart from male clients and employees, and they can be covered as much as they want, including wearing a face veil. We almost never, ever, in fact, I can't think of one time when we saw a woman working in a shop, in a place where she would have to wait on customers and deal with unrelated males who would come in. So that's, I think, a clue of the kind of segregation that still exists. The university was a pleasant exception to the rule for us. It was probably the place that I felt the most at home. And again, on the university campus, the vast majority of Yemeni women wore scarves and coats, but most of them did not wear veils. And there seemed to be a different code of conduct that permitted unrelated men and women to have conversation with each other on the university campus, which would be more frowned upon in the general street or public area. Well, what are the reasons, some of the reasons for this segregation? Well, first of all, I think the veiling and seclusion of women, which is one way that segregation is implemented, probably some of it comes from influence from Byzantine and Turkish occupations. The Byzantine Greek Christians influenced the Turks, who then occupied North Yemen and passed on some of their cultural habits to the Yemeni Muslims. The evidence my women friends cited for this outside influence on things like veiling is that they pointed out that even though rural women dress modestly and usually wear scarves, which by the way is considered an Islamic observance because the Quran does mention covering one's hair, the rural women almost never wear face veils unless it's been imposed on them by some maybe really strict religious ruler or leader in their own community. And that is seen as evidence that the women in the rural areas, which were almost never colonized by outsiders such as the Ottoman Turks, tended not to pick up these outside influences like veiling and seclusion of women. And I think there's a certain amount of evidence for that outside influence. But I think the motive for gender segregation, of which veiling and seclusion is just one small part, also comes from fear of sexuality and fear of behavior that would weaken the family, both in terms of the women's honor. A woman's behavior sexually reflects on the honor of her birth family in Arab Muslim culture. So that's one big concern. And also the stability of the current nuclear family is thought to be enhanced by keeping the genders segregated so that there's less chance for such things as infidelity. I think veiling and seclusion are also thought to be protection for women, that when they're out in public, the more they cover up, the less they'll be harassed because it will send a clear message that they are not available or they're not to be tampered with. And I must admit that it was very interesting for me to watch how I and my daughter changed our behavior so that we would also feel less threatened. And I almost never had to wear a scarf scarf. As a Western woman, I wasn't expected to do that, but I certainly did wear a long coat and wore extremely modest dress and felt that it contributed to a lessening of the amount of attention that I attracted in society. I think also, as I said before, there's a belief by some that segregation of genders is more Islamic, and that is, of course, highly debatable if you look at the early history of Islam, the degree to which the wives and daughters of the Prophet Muhammad, for example, participated in the new society and were leaders, and even spiritual advisors. I think the issue of gender segregation is one that is being dealt with by modern Muslim thinkers. As far as marriage and family are concerned, here's a few observations for you. It was also a shock to us, in addition to prevailing in seclusion, that I'd say at least 90% and probably more of all marriages are still arranged by families in Yemen. And that means that the father of the bride and or groom usually has the ultimate say on who the spouse will be for the child. But women probably have the most actual influence, because when a son is ready to choose a wife or have a wife chosen for him, his father doesn't have a clue as to who the available women are. His father has been prohibited from contact with any females except perhaps his nieces or third cousins or something like that at family gatherings, extended family gatherings. So it's the women, the mothers, the sisters, the aunts, the grandmothers, who generally suggest and choose a maid for the men, and vice versa. The men help somewhat with choosing males, but it's the network of women who know all about both the men and the women, because they have access to both the men and the women. The men have access only to the other men, usually. So it's an interesting kind of paradox where marriages are arranged, but often women have the most control. When that rule is deviated from, it can cause problems. One of our favorite students, a senior English major in the university, shared with us, we were discussing a short story with her one day that had featured a very strong mother-in-law figure. And she shared with us that her husband, she and her husband were both university students, and they had one young son. Excuse me. She shared that she had been the choice of her husband, not of her mother-in-law. And her in-laws had gone along with their son's choice, but she felt that forever after, she would not be on a par with the other daughters-in-law in the family, because the mother-in-law had not been the one to initiate her as a choice for her son. She had to work even harder, in other words, to maintain good relations. She also, by the way, shared that her husband, when they were first married, since they were both full-time university students, was very willing to share housework with her, even cooking. But when his mother and sisters found out about it, they chided him for doing this unmasculine activity, and he was pretty much forced by their pressure to stop sharing that kind of work with her. We found, by the way, that in the university community, that kind of role sharing was much more common than in the larger society, and I suspect that's also true often in this country as well. At a very young age, marriage is arranged for people. It wasn't until 1978 that North Yemen got the law that prevented marriage of women under the age of 15. And so the usual age is maybe 17 or 18 for women, 19, 20, 21 for men. But often younger, often even prepubescent girls are married to older men. We were told that there's a big problem in some of the villages in Yemen, because it's considered quite desirable to marry a person from your own village. Even a relative is considered quite desirable. But many villages are simply running out of marriageable females above the age of 15. And so men are kind of having to put reservations in for young girls as possible spouses. Another aspect of marriage and family in Yemen is polygamy. It's definitely a decreasing practice, I think largely because of economic constraints. The Quran mandates that if you have more than one wife, they must all be treated equally. That means if your first wife has a flat with 5 rooms, your second wife must also have a flat with 5 rooms, etc. It is a decreasing practice, but it still occurs. And we were even told that in the university community it occurs. Often, not often perhaps, but occasionally, a male university professor will have an arranged marriage, will have a wife who was quite young at the time of the marriage, who perhaps produces 6, 8, 10 children. And then 20 years later, this university professor, who by now probably has a PhD from some country in the West, decides that he would like to have also a wife who's more of an intellectual partner. And so there's the phenomenon of their not divorcing the first wife, but simply taking a new, younger wife, often a student or a graduate student. And that the university in Yemen has as part of its fringe benefit package for professors providing housing. So now the university is in some cases being forced to provide 2 identical apartments for one professor. I don't want to give you a misinformation about this, however. I think I read recently that most estimates suggest that if you take all Arab Muslim countries, probably only about 1% of men have multiple wives, so it's a very small phenomenon. As far as the rigid gender segregation, there's also fairly rigid gender role stereotyping or divisions in terms of role. Men are required by Islam to support their families. If women work and earn money, or if they inherit money from their nuclear family, they are not bound by Islam to share any of that wealth for the upkeep of the family. That's entirely the male's responsibility. The women's responsibility under Islam is primarily to satisfy their husbands sexually. That is considered the primary responsibility of the wife in Islam. The Imam, the religious political ruler of North Yemen, added in the 1960s or 50s, or maybe it was, that women also had the responsibility of doing housework. There are many, many expectations for women regarding care of children, and also care not only of their own children, but of their husband's extended family, and especially the parents-in-law. There are many expectations about how a wife will help care for them. I think it's important to note that gender segregation does not necessarily mean that Arab Muslim women have second-class status in their society. They certainly would by our societal standards. But my friend and anthropologist Andrea Rue has observed about Egypt, and I think it applies to Arab Muslim women everywhere. She says, Arab Muslim women are often the, quote, central figures in the central institution of the society. When the family is paramount, women control those things that are most valued by the men: sex, honor, children, and a happy, well-organized household. And thus, women have tremendous power in the private realm that reaches into the public realm. Finally, I want to say just a bit about education and work outside the home. Before 1960, in North Yemen, only 5% of male children were enrolled in Quranic schools. There were no public or secular schools and no females in school at all. This was up until 1960. By 1986, women had now, by 86, comprised almost 20% of the pre-university school enrollment. That's still bad, but it's a big improvement from 0. And I think the percentage is up considerably from 1986 to recently when we were there. There's also a changing workforce. As Ryan already mentioned, there was a huge return of male workers from the Gulf states, and they have had difficulty finding jobs in Yemen. Often they live in the city of Sana'a, their families live in the villages. So one of the major occupations in Sana'a is now outfitting little shops that feed all these men who live apart from their families looking for work in the capital. So if you want to run a little restaurant or drive your own car as a taxi, those are 2 things that are kind of instant employment in Yemen. As far as women's jobs are concerned, those women who work outside the homes generally are still in so-called women's professions such as health and education. In rural labor, ironically, development often works against women's freedom and flexibility and contribution and control over agriculture. I'll just give you one example. In some of the research I did on UN studies in Yemen on rural women and development, it pointed out that the introduction of paved roads in the rural areas of North Yemen worked against women's participation in agriculture. And here's why. Before the roads were paved, women could go about their home territory pretty much worried about what might happen to them. They could wander, or they could go far away from their home with their goats, or collecting their grass that they were going to feed the family cow that night. But when the roads got paved, there was a much greater likelihood that outsiders, people outside of the extended tribal group, would come into the area in motor vehicles. And women who were out in the fields maybe a mile or 2 or 3 from their home or their village would be vulnerable to contact with these outsiders, men, obviously. And so that has worked as a restriction on women's freedom of movement and flexibility. That's a quite ironic development, I think. Well, I want to just conclude by saying a little bit about the change that's going on in Yemen. I've already alluded to that. There's, I think, 2 big reasons why the public realm and the private realm in Yemen are breaking down somewhat. Women are entering the public realm because there's a tremendous amount of interest in education for women, and there's economic necessity. Parents are now often encouraging their adolescent daughters to get a marketable skill, either if they happen to lose their husband or if their husband can't make a living wage, which of course, in the kind of inflation that the whole Arab world is experiencing, is very necessary. Secondly, a factor in change is that when families have a positive experience with allowing their young women to go to the university, get a job, not have a face veil on in public, they still dress very modestly. When that happens and families discover that the daughter doesn't lose her chastity or that her own family doesn't break apart, then that kind of success encourages other families to take that kind of bold step. And so my friends in the English department said that they thought that was one of the biggest factors in change. There still is a tremendous amount of education that needs to go on, both in terms of just pure basic education and also education about opportunities for women. And there is, by the way, in Yemen, a very strong revivalist movement of Islam that's often more political than religious, that wants to put into law such legislation that women must wear the same kind of dress that they must wear in Saudi Arabia, that women must have their husband's permission to leave the house every day, and that young women must not be permitted to leave Yemen for higher education without the escort of a male relative. So that kind of thing, there's pressure to make that into legislation. The vast majority of Yemeni Muslims do not want that kind of legislation, but they're facing that kind of pressure. A few conclusions. I hope you can see that the situation of Middle Eastern Muslim women is very complex, that gender segregation does not necessarily always mean oppression, and when it does, it's often oppression for men as well as for women. There are multiple factors that underlie conditions for women. And finally, that Middle Eastern Muslim women want positive change. They want liberation, but they usually do not want Western-style liberation. Because of all of the media impressions they receive from our old soap operas and B-grade movies, etc., they fear such Western extremes as rape and sexual abuse, the removal of sexuality from marriage, and the deterioration of family life and religious values. Instead, what they want is liberation that still accepts complementary roles for males and females and still values Islamic principles and the centrality of the health of the family. Thank you, and please ask us some questions. Increasingly, the question was, do the Yemenis watch American TV, such as soap operas? First of all, it depends a lot on where you are. If you have enough money to stay at a Western-style hotel that has a satellite dish, then chances are you'll see some reruns of American TV. If you have only an antenna, you have a choice of 2 stations, Sana'a and Aden, and there you will see primarily Jordanian and Egyptian soap operas and not very many American shows. But that doesn't mean they don't have American shows. The way they get them is on videotapes. There are videotape rental stores everywhere. Many people have VCRs. Many people who don't have cars, for example, or washing machines have TVs and VCRs. And they can even buy things like MTV or rent MTV on videotape. So when I asked my students, we were doing an English practice, some brainstorming, I asked them to name some American movie stars, and the first person they thought of was Madonna. And these are my students in Yemen. Yes. The question was, in light of Yemen's stand on the U.S.-led attack on Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait, how did the average Yemeni person respond to us as American visitors? Well, let's see if I can give a short answer. The short answer is, everywhere we've ever gone in the Arab world, the people we've met have separated us as American people from the government. So that is, whether it's in Gaza or Damascus or Baghdad or Yemen, we've had people be extremely magnanimous toward us as foreign visitors. The Arab hospitality code that maybe started with Abraham in the book of Genesis is still quite accurate. So people were extremely warm toward us. When we first arrived in Yemen, in September, we did, even out in villages, people would ask us in Arabic what we thought of George Bush, for example. And we even found some Yemenis who liked George Bush. Hard to imagine because they were on the other side of that conflict. So there was that kind of interest in our political views, but it was usually on a very sort of casual basis, and it didn't seem as if they were probing for information that they would use to make a judgment about us. For the most part, people didn't talk a whole lot about the U.S. role in the crisis. They called it, by the way, the Gulf crisis, not the Gulf War. What they more wanted us to be aware of is all the negative effects of the Gulf War on their lives, which were numerous. And I think, if they had their wish, Americans would get a little bit longer memory about these things. And in this case, unfortunately, with this conflict, with the exception of the very unfortunate families who lost children or family members on the American side of the Gulf War, for the most part, Americans were able to put it out of their mind roughly 20 seconds after the ground war ended 2 years ago. That is certainly not the case for the people who are living with the economic after effects, a great amount of deprivation, inflation, return of male workers who have no jobs, no infrastructure, that kind of thing. As far as anything really negative, I can't think of anything that happened to us in Yemen, but I will tell you that during our last week in Sana'a in January was when the Bush administration decided to bomb Baghdad once again. And there was some concern by people in the American embassy that that might cause some anti-American outpouring or demonstrations. Instead, what we experienced was finally people who had been very apolitical with us all during the 5 months. That was sort of like the final straw. When we again bombed Baghdad and civilians were killed, it was like their sort of guard dropped down, and instead of just dealing with us on a polite level, they just sort of said, why is this being done to us? They took it very personally. Even though they don't like Saddam Hussein, they felt as fellow Arabs, they were being, again, unfairly punished and attacked by the West, and wanted to know, what is it about us that makes America so willing to attack us and even to kill our civilians for our own political interests? And so we did have a lot of very deep and agonizing conversations about that.
I think related to the children when we met, young children, I wonder how they're raised. Are they segregated in school? Do they play together before they go to school? And what do you see for the future then? Are they going to continue these traditions, or will they be different as they grow?
Yeah, I'm sure that the question is about the rearing of children and how segregated that is and how they're treated. I I didn't have a lot of time to investigate that, but I certainly did ask the women and every chance I got about child-rearing practices. Because, for instance, some of the books I read, written by Westerners analyzing Arab culture, claimed, for example, that even though female infanticide was stopped by Muhammad, that still there is, for example, great preference for male babies, and that female, I even read one book, very recent book, and fairly credible on a lot of levels, that suggested that Arab Muslim female babies are breastfed half as long as male babies, as just a sign of the inherent discrimination. Well, I gradually got around to asking about that in a very indirect way, so it wouldn't look obvious. And the women I was with had no idea what I was talking about, and they couldn't imagine that kind of differentiation happening. I asked them a lot about how they differentiated between raising boys and girls, and it seemed very similar. They said, if anything, perhaps we push our sons to study harder in school because our girls are all well-motivated students anyway. We don't have to push them. And then when you get to the adolescent level, they said there are some families, and my friends in the university, of course, didn't approve this, there are some families that stop pushing their girls academically because if they're going to get married young, they're really going to need to have domestic skills. That's a very high expectation. And so the family emphasis shifts toward giving the girl, the daughter, domestic skills and de-emphasizing academic concerns. However, that is definitely changing. And there are many families that want their daughters to have both. I never met any families who didn't think it mattered whether their daughters had domestic skills. That all still matters. But many who also want them to have plenty of other opportunities. Young children do play together a fair amount. The schools are not segregated until at least you get to the secondary level, and then there are both co-ed and private segregated, gender-segregated schools. But at the primary levels, they are together. The young girls are covered, they don't wear face veils, but they dress modestly. Also, I would say there is not the kind of recreation for children in developing countries. I mean, this isn't just Arab Muslim countries, this is, quote, third world countries. You know, children don't have the kind of access to recreation and play and crafts and music and all of that stuff that we have. And so what we saw mostly was little girls sitting outside their family houses watching little boys play soccer with balls they'd made out of rags and twine or something like that. Occasionally we did see also girls playing soccer up to about maybe the age of 12 or something like that. But I think there's definitely going to be change, but certainly not change that will threaten what they consider the moral fiber, I guess you could say. Other questions? Don? I think in all, the question had to do with the common belief in life after death in both Islam and Christianity, but whether on a daily praxis level there isn't more of a sense of living for the life in the hereafter in Islam versus living for the here and now, say in American style quasi-Christianity, I'll call it. I think there's not very much difference in that regard. I think there's a great amount of care and concern about this life, at least at the level of family interaction in Arab Muslim countries. I mean, what we hear about in the media is people that are willing to die in a suicide truck bombing because they don't care about this life because they know they're going to be rewarded in the afterlife. I think that's very much the exception. I think most people are quite concerned about both this life and the next life. However, the very strong belief that God will be just in the hereafter, if not in the here and now, I think is quite operative in people's ability to be stoic in the face of things like war, poverty, you know, the kind of things that people in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon have had to deal with now for 40 years. I think we call it disparagingly fatalism. I think they view it in a much more positive light as sort of trying to make the best of the here and now, but living always in the awareness that God will be just. Ultimately, if we don't see God's justice in this life, we will see God's justice in the next life. Obviously, that is a teaching of both the Christian testaments as well. But I think in the daily lives of Muslims, there's perhaps more of a sort of visceral sense of that. There was a question you want to ask?
Yes, I wanted to ask you to what extent women of the Middle East are still raised to think of themselves as unwashed and unclean. And I wonder, I think this is mostly because of the menstrual cycle. Does that change post-menopausally? And then I wanted to add this, that this summer, the International Council of Nurses meets in Spain for its 20th Quadrennial Congress. And 12 years ago in Los Angeles, the theme for the following 4 years was to try to take public health measures to prevent clitoridectomies. This was raining in Africa, and we elected a woman doctor, Eunice Moreno-Tremaine, as president for the next 4 years. And I don't get to see what's...
Yes. The question has to do with attitudes toward female uncleanness and how much those still persist. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, there's a whole tradition in the Hebrew scriptures about clean and unclean. And unclean things are those that often have to do with bodily processes like birth, reproduction, and death. So that the book of Leviticus, for example, describes as unclean semen or menstrual flow, that kind of thing. I'm certainly not an expert on this, but you can't be a student of the Bible and not confront it. And it seems to me a lot of it started out as being purely a matter of ritual cleanness. Leviticus says, our God is holy, therefore we must be holy. Unfortunately, from my point of view as a modern woman, that then got generalized into a sense of women being unclean, not just ritually, but perhaps in terms of moral character or whatever. I think that still is operative in a lot of Islam. Islam is a religion that very much is built on Judaism and Christianity. So that same attitude about uncleanness permeates Islam, both at the scriptural level and at the praxis level, to a much greater extent than Christianity. I mean, my preferred reading of Jesus in the Gospels is to abrogate that kind of obsession with clean and unclean. Everything from Jesus healing the woman with the continuous flow of blood to Jesus touching lepers, all of that kind of thing. You still see a considerable amount of that operative in Islam. For instance, Muslim men try not to have physical contact with their wives during the wives' period. Now, this doesn't just mean intercourse, which is forbidden in, I'm sure, both Orthodox Judaism and traditional Islam. But it also, many Muslim men don't even want to bump into their wives physically during this period because it will contaminate them ritually, and when they pray 5 times a day, they'll maybe have to do extra ablutions in order to eliminate that contamination. Just another example, there was an article in the New York Times several days ago, I didn't see it, but a colleague cut it off for me and told me about a leper colony in Yemen. And one of the men in the colony has been pretty much ostracized from his family as an unclean leper, even though he's not contagious. And he told the Western reporter who was there studying this colony that he felt his own leprosy was God's punishment to him because he had once had intercourse with his wife during her period. So I think it's still very operative for a lot of people. I didn't get a sense that the educated women felt crippled by this. I think they observe it and would probably respect the male's wishes not to, quote, be contaminated. But I didn't get a sense that it had a negative impact on their self-image, I guess you would say. By the way, for those of you who don't know a lot about the local Muslim community, there are like 7 or 8 operating mosques now in the Twin Cities. And I take my students to 2 of them on a regular basis, the Islam students at St. Thomas, and at the Masjid Mujahid in South Minneapolis, which is largely African-American converts to Islam. The first time I took a group of students, the woman who helped me set up the visit, explained to me that any of my women students, and myself included, who might be menstruating that week would please stay out in the narthex area and not go into the main prayer space. And so they clearly are observing that demarcation, which also Orthodox Jews continue to observe. So I think there's someone who's been waiting. Oh, we have time for one more? Okay. Well, this person has been waiting for a long time, so I'll just take one more then. Yes. Excellent question. Question has to do with how marriage is enacted and celebrated in a culture that has such strict gender segregation. I'll try to make this brief, but it's a really important issue which I should have probably talked about more earlier. First of all, if you ever hear someone say that it is Islamic for a marriage to be arranged in which the parties were not willingly in agreement with, that is not Islamic. That is an abuse of Islam to force two people to marry against their will. It is also not inherently Islamic to forbid them from becoming acquainted. In fact, the very conservative Muslim leaders I met in North Yemen are encouraging families to have the young man and the young woman become acquainted under obviously controlled circumstances, such as being in a chaperone mixed group in the family parlor or something. But there is a tremendous emphasis now, I think, on doing away with practices that are not Islamic and that are not contributing to healthy marriages. There are people who say, men, for example, who want to divorce the chosen wife when they see them for the first time on the wedding night. There are many cases still where that's the first time that the young man and young woman have ever seen each other face to face. As far as the wedding itself is concerned, the celebrations are almost totally separate. There is a huge men's party, a huge women's party. However, sometimes the bride and groom make visits to the other parties. Probably more often the groom comes and visits the women's party than vice versa, but it does happen both ways, that the couple does make visits, but the parties, even if they're in the same house, they're in totally separate spaces, and they can be at separate times even. The exception is more westernized families that have maybe worked abroad. They'll perhaps rent a big ballroom at one of the Western-style hotels and have at least part of the celebration be mixed gender-wise. But I should say that it was a very educational experience for us to learn that, in fact, arranged marriages can succeed. I mean, in our culture, that, of course, was practiced generations ago, is not practiced now, and I was very prejudiced against the possibility for success for that kind of marriage, but I learned after 5 months of meeting people that they often become very loving, sharing partners in marriage, and I think have probably a considerably lower divorce rate than we do with our approach. So we should try to keep an open mind about these things and realize that our own beliefs about gender are just as culture biased as theirs are in many cases. Well, thank you very much for your attention.